There are moments in Hollywood history that transcend the boundaries of the silver screen, moments where two remarkable human beings meet, and through the alchemy of shared creativity, forge a connection that outlasts the films they made together. For Hayley Mills, one of those defining moments came in 1961, when a 14-year-old girl from a distinguished British theatrical family stood on a Disney soundstage and came face to face with one of the most commanding women in the history of cinema, the legendary Irish actress Maureen O'Hara. Now 79 years old, Hayley Mills has spent decades carefully guarding the intimate details of her personal and professional life. She has always been gracious with fans, generous in interviews, and warmly reflective about a career that began in extraordinary fashion and never truly lost its luster. But on the subject of Maureen O'Hara, her co-star in Disney's beloved 1961 classic The Parent Trap, Mills has, until recently, remained unusually quiet, not out of resentment or regret, but out of something rarer in Hollywood: genuine reverence. Some experiences, she has suggested, feel almost too precious to hand over to the noise of public consumption. That silence, however, has finally given way, and what Hayley Mills has chosen to share is not a tale of rivalry, tension, or the kind of behind-the-scenes drama that gossip columns have always craved. It is something far more meaningful, a portrait of mentorship, of quiet courage, and of a friendship between two women separated by a generation, but connected by an unspoken understanding of what it truly means to survive and flourish in an industry that has never made either task easy. To understand why Maureen O'Hara's influence on Hayley Mills was so profound, it helps to understand the world both women were navigating at the time. When filming began on The Parent Trap, Hayley was already a rising star, fresh from her Academy Juvenile Award-winning performance in Pollyanna the previous year. She was charming, talented, and beloved by audiences around the world. But she was also, at her core, still a child, a teenager stepping into the enormous machine of Hollywood filmmaking with a famous father, a supportive family, and a great deal of natural ability, but limited experience of the industry's harsher realities. Maureen O'Hara, by contrast, had seen it all. Born in Ranelagh, Dublin, in 1920, she had been acting professionally since her teenage years in Ireland, before being brought to Hollywood by the legendary director Charles Laughton. By the time she appeared in The Parent Trap, O'Hara had already delivered iconic performances in How Green Was My Valley, Miracle on 34th Street, and The Quiet Man alongside John Wayne, with whom she would share one of cinema's most celebrated screen partnerships. She had fought studio executives, challenged directors, and navigated decades of an industry that routinely underestimated women regardless of their talent or accomplishments. She had, in every meaningful sense, earned her place. The collision of these two worlds, the wide-eyed British teenager and the seasoned Irish screen queen, might easily have produced awkwardness, or worse, indifference. What it produced instead was something neither of them might have anticipated: a deeply formative bond that would leave its fingerprints on Hayley Mills's life long after the cameras stopped rolling. Mills has spoken openly about the initial intimidation she felt in O'Hara's presence. There was nothing unkind about it. O'Hara was never cruel, never dismissive, but she carried herself with a certainty and authority that made the air in a room feel different the moment she entered it. She was a tall, striking woman, with that extraordinary copper hair and a voice that seemed carved from the Irish landscape itself, musical and strong in equal measure. For a shy teenager still finding her footing in front of major Hollywood cameras, simply being in the same space as Maureen O'Hara was a quietly overwhelming experience. What quickly became apparent to Hayley, however, was that beneath the formidable surface lay something far more generous. O'Hara held everyone around her to a high standard. That much was evident from the first days of production. She believed in the work, in the story, in the responsibility that came with standing before a camera and asking an audience to invest their emotions in what you were offering them. She did not tolerate carelessness or complacency, but she also never withheld the guidance and support that a younger performer genuinely needed. Between takes, O'Hara would speak to Hayley not as a star condescending to a newcomer, but as one professional acknowledging the seriousness of another. She spoke about the craft of acting, about listening rather than simply waiting for your turn to speak, about finding the truth in a scene rather than performing the surface of it, about the discipline required to sustain a career over decades rather than merely burning bright for a season. These were not lectures. They were conversations, warm, honest, and grounded in the kind of hard-won wisdom that no acting class could replicate. One particular piece of advice that O'Hara offered has stayed with Hayley Mills across the entirety of her adult life. Sitting together during a break in filming, O'Hara looked at the young actress with characteristic directness and said something along the lines of, "You must know who you are before the world decides for you." It was the kind of statement that sounds almost simple until you sit with it long enough to feel its weight. For Hayley Mills, that weight grew considerably as the years passed. She would go on to experience the particular pressures of transitioning from a beloved child star into an adult actress, a notoriously difficult journey that Hollywood has historically not made easy. She would navigate relationships, motherhood, the shifting demands of a long career, and the relentless expectations of audiences who had fallen in love with the wholesome, sunny girl from Pollyanna and were not always eager to accept that she had grown up. In all of those moments, O'Hara's quiet instruction functioned as something close to a compass. To know yourself, not the version of yourself that studios have crafted, not the image that fan magazines have printed, not the character that audiences believe they own, but the actual, private, irreducible human being underneath all of it. O'Hara had fought for that knowledge in herself across decades of professional survival, and she recognized in the young Hayley Mills both the talent and the vulnerability that made such self-knowledge urgently necessary. Beyond the professional mentorship, what Hayley Mills has come to treasure most in her memories of Maureen O'Hara is the simple humanity of the woman. O'Hara was not given to Hollywood performance off-screen. She did not cultivate an image or manage her persona with the anxious precision that the industry often demands. She was, by all accounts, exactly who she appeared to be, proud, principled, fiercely independent, and possessed of a humor that could transform the atmosphere on a difficult filming day in an instant. Mills has recalled with particular warmth the stories O'Hara would tell between setups. Stories of growing up in Dublin, of her early stage work in Ireland, of the culture shock of arriving in Hollywood as a young woman from a completely different world. She would speak of John Wayne with obvious affection and an equally obvious mischief, recounting their adventures on location with a kind of storytelling skill that reminded everyone listening that they were in the presence of someone who had genuinely lived a remarkable life rather than merely performed one. And she would laugh. That laugh, large and unguarded and entirely genuine, is something that Hayley Mills has mentioned more than once when speaking of O'Hara. It was the laugh of a woman who had made her peace with the world on her own terms, who had nothing left to prove and therefore nothing left to perform. In an industry where almost everything is carefully calculated, Maureen O'Hara's laughter felt, to the young Hayley Mills, like something close to freedom. The friendship that developed between them was never the kind that filled gossip columns. There were no dramatic declarations, no highly public gestures of solidarity. O'Hara was, by nature, a private person whose deepest loyalties expressed themselves quietly, through a hand on a shoulder before a difficult scene, through a word of honest encouragement offered without fanfare, through the simple act of paying genuine attention to the people she respected. And she respected Hayley Mills. That respect, communicated without sentimentality, but with absolute sincerity, meant more to the younger actress than any amount of public praise. Mills has reflected in recent years on the particular significance of having an older woman in the industry offer her that kind of regard. Hollywood has never been especially kind to women, regardless of their talent, and it has been especially unforgiving in the way it pits them against one another, encouraging competition where collaboration would be far more valuable, treating female solidarity as naivety rather than strength. What Maureen O'Hara offered Hayley Mills was a living counterargument to all of that. Here was a woman who had every reason to be guarded, every incentive to protect her own position at the expense of a younger colleague, and who chose instead to be generous. That generosity, Mills has made clear, was not weakness. O'Hara had simply reached a point of security in herself that made pettiness not just unnecessary but uninteresting. She had larger things to think about, larger values to uphold. And in doing so, she demonstrated to Hayley Mills that it was possible to move through a long and demanding career in this industry without surrendering either your integrity or your compassion. When Maureen O'Hara passed away in October 2015 at the age of 95, the tributes that poured in from across the entertainment world spoke repeatedly of her strength, her beauty, her fearlessness. All of it was true. But for Hayley Mills, the loss was more intimate than any of the official remembrances could quite capture. It was the loss of a woman who had shaped her understanding of her own profession, and more significantly, her understanding of herself. "I wish I had told her more clearly what she meant to me," Mills has said. "There is a particular kind of regret that comes with outliving the people who helped make you who you are, the dawning awareness that gratitude, however deeply felt, sometimes goes insufficiently expressed while there is still time to express it." Hayley Mills carries that particular regret with characteristic grace, transforming it into something generous. By speaking of Maureen O'Hara now, with honesty and detail and love, she ensures that the older actress's influence continues to ripple outward. Today, at 79, Hayley Mills occupies a place in the cultural imagination that very few performers ever achieve. She is both a living piece of film history and a working actress who has never stopped growing in her craft. She has navigated all the complications that accompany a life lived largely in public. The scrutiny, the expectation, the perpetual negotiation between private self and public image, with a resilience and a warmth that her co-stars and colleagues have consistently remarked upon across the decades. It is not difficult, looking at the arc of her life and career, to trace some portion of that resilience back to a soundstage in 1961, and to a tall Irish woman with copper hair, and an unwavering belief that the people around her were capable of doing their very best work if someone simply expected them to. Maureen O'Hara expected that of Hayley Mills. And Hayley Mills, across 65 years of a remarkable life, has never stopped trying to honor that expectation. She was more than a co-star, Mills has said simply. She was the kind of woman who shows you what is possible. And in the end, that is the most enduring performance Maureen O'Hara ever gave, not on any screen, but in the quiet, lasting transformation of a young girl into a woman who knew exactly who she was. Like, subscribe, and follow for more.